Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. We are about to get started. So I just wanted to welcome everyone to the Silvopasture Systems in the Southeast US webinars. We are gonna, first, I'm Liliane Silva. I'm the Forage Specialist for Clemson University. And we are gonna be having this webinar today, and also we're going to have another webinar next week, and then a few days that we're going to be sharing more information about towards the end of the today. So before we get started and I introduce our speakers today, I just wanted to go ahead and introduce Mrs. Janet Steele. Jen, do you want to say hi?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Janet Steele. I'm a forestry and wildlife agent that covers 6 counties just south of Columbia and over towards the Savannah Valley.
Thank you, Janet. So Janet and I organized this series together, and we are going to be having different topics today. Just before we get started, I wanted to mention a few housekeeping rules. We are going to ask everybody to stay muted throughout the presentations today. Then we're going to have time for questions at the end of each presentation. So we're going to also be monitoring the chat. So if you have any questions that you'd like to right away, feel free to do that, because we're going to ask those questions at the end of each presentation and discuss about them later. So just so we can get started, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker. Dr. John Fike. He works for Virginia Tech University. Dr. Fike received his master's degree in forage agronomy from Virginia Tech and his PhD degree from University of Florida. He's a professor and an extension specialist, and his program focuses on grassland production management, and he's engaged in several efforts to develop new information and educational activities related to animal production, forage production, animal welfare, and ecosystem benefits, including on silvopasture systems, which is what he's going to be talking about today. So his talk is going to focus more on a general overview of the establishment and management to some extent of for silvopasture production systems. So without further ado, Dr. Fike, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Liliane. I just thinking here, I'm not 100% sure that I have hit the objectives exactly like I should have. And I also hope that I don't step on Bruno's toes or get in his lane too much. But I wanted to give some kind of overview of silvopasture systems. I'm going to give just a little bit of history how I got engaged with this practice, and I'll give some definition and historical context. And then I want to spend a bit of time talking about the resources in these systems and some of our research results, and then kind of how producers are approaching some of this. So without further ado, I was engaged with silvopasture about 20 years ago when this guy on the left, Jim Berger, came to me and said, "Hey, Fike, I've got this project. We got these little young trees out here in the system, and we're doing this agroforestry practice called silvopasture, and I need somebody to do some forages work in there. Would you be interested?" And I, as a kid off the farm, in my head immediately said, "Nobody wants trees and pastures." As a young scientist who needed something to do, I said, "Sure." And so I got engaged with that, and it's been an interesting ride. Now, part of my perspective is clouded by the fact that a lot of people think about cows in the woods as silvopasture. They get that confused. Silvopasture is not cows in the woods, and it's not a lone tree in a pasture. So try to set our boundaries here in terms of defining what silvopasture is. It's a sustainable land management practice that's integrating intensive animal husbandry, silviculture, and forage management, where the trees can provide some kind of long-term return and the livestock grazing can generate an annual income. And in some circles, we talk about this in context of a 4I principle. So we're doing this intentionally. We're not just dumping cows in the woods with a boundary. It's integrated. So I'm thinking about how do trees and livestock, how can I manage those together? It's intensive. And if there's one fundamental piece that applies to silvopasture systems, whether you're in Vermont or Virginia or in Brazil or other places, if it's going to be done well, you have to apply management. And then, how do these pieces interact? So one of my conceptions, again, nobody wants trees and pastures, but, what's my conception based on? It's based on being able to go to the local feed and seed store and buy fence posts and supplements and nitrogen fertilizer and whatever else. But these systems probably were pretty common or somewhat common, at least in the Appalachian region, prior to those kinds of markets and changes in our economy. And why would that be? I mean, if I had a tree that could put nitrogen into the system and support the understory forage, it provided shade, kept my livestock comfortable, and it might be a source of fuel or posts, building materials, something like a black locust tree. That would be fantastic. Or, black walnuts, something that could provide feed resource for the family or for the pigs or whatever. So these systems aren't new. We just kind of marched away from them as our economy and other opportunities for building systems changed. And there's some early literature that shows greater productivity with forages under different tree species. And this is some data out of the 50s, out of Arkansas, and they were looking at animal performance and saw that cows had better gain under natural shade. Calves, shade source didn't really matter that much, but calves gained more when they had a source of shade. And one of the interesting pieces here is that it's not so much more grazing time, it's changes in behavior. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. So when we think about these systems, we need to think about what are the resources and how do we manage that? Because that's what this is all about. It's managing resources. Well, you've got light, moisture, soil nutrients, opportunity for nutrient returns. And if you look at the picture on the right, you'll see temporal partitioning. So sometimes one thing is growing when something else is not. And the tree may have access to deeper soil nutrients than the grass can get to. That term exclusive access probably means really something like excluding access, where the tree can prevent the grass root from getting to those nutrients. So there's some of those kinds of dynamics that go on in these systems as well. And how do we manage that? One of the other features that that's inherent in these systems is that there can be competition. And I sort of alluded to that with the previous slide. So in the, as an academic, I got to throw a little jargon at you. So thinking about competitive partitioning, that's where you've got two crops that are competing for the same resources. But the interesting thing is that when I've got these different crops competing for these resources, the use efficiency can go up, and it will be greater than if I just have a single species. And so again, in a silvopastoral context, I'm trying to manage the competitive interactions so that even if I have some negative effects, from one species to the other, across the whole, I've got a more productive system. And that's really, I think that we can do better than that. And I'll show you some of our data that would suggest that. So I want to kind of hit one comment or concept called land equivalency ratio. And so if you look at the system, the light blue bars are forages and the dark blue bars are cattle. I didn't put one in here for trees in an open system, but you could imagine having a forested system, plantation forest as well. And so in an open system where I don't have trees, I can get 100% of my forage yield, is going to give me 100% of my cattle yield. And so that land equivalency ratio is 100%, or we just say it's 1. If I put a silvopasture in, I might take 20 or even more % reduction in forage yield. Doesn't sound too good, does it? Well, but maybe I lose a little bit of cattle, and that's not too good, right? But I'm 90% on this graphic. And I can't get 100% of the trees. I didn't plant this wall-to-wall trees, but when I put those pieces together, I've got a tree crop in addition to a cattle crop. And so the land equivalency ratio in this example is 1.2 or 120%. So it's more than what I would get with just trees or just cattle alone. And then the question gets to be, is it worth making these kind of management adjustments to be able to do all that? There are some data, this land equivalency ratio or over yielding is another way to describe it. People look at forage yield response when I start integrating trees. And sometimes if I'm based on forages, I can get 50% more yield. If it's based on livestock, maybe about 40% more yield. So 1.4 LER. And this is some work that was done by a former student of mine looking across the literature. And that's what the literature tells us. We integrate trees with pasture systems, we can get greater productivity than we've just the pasture system on its own. So again, thinking about resources. First one would, most people would think about would be light. And with cool season forages, the leaves are light saturated on an individual leaf basis at probably 50% full sun. So when you put that in a canopy, they need more sunlight. Light saturation is probably in the 60 to 70% full sun range. That means there's extra light that's not going to be utilized by just the forage stand. So if I can grow trees in combination with that, that's a good thing. Another thing, when you put a tree into the system, that light doesn't just impinge directly from the sun to the canopy. It's going to bounce around through the tree leaves, and as that bounces around and changes direction, that creates diffuse light, and that diffuse light is absorbed or used with greater efficiency. And then there's, again, the quality and the quantity and the timing of light that's affected by the types of trees that you have. So I put up these fancy tree cartoons to give you an estimate, an idea of like a pine or a something like a maple or an oak in the middle, or maybe something like a walnut on the right, which has a kind of a more open canopy, may have more compound leaves that allow more light in. And in my context, we often talk about cool season and warm season grasses. We can also get trees that act sort of like a warm season tree in the sense in that they don't leaf out until later, and they might drop leaves earlier. So if you consider the yellow line, the warm season tree, if I've integrated that type of tree into the system, I can reduce the competition for light early in the season when the cool season grasses are growing rapidly. And then I can drop off those leaves in the fall when those cool season grasses are picking up production again. So I can try to find ways to complement trees and forages. Now, this is for South Carolina. You may not want to fool with hardwood trees. So we have to think about different dynamics for managing, say, something with pine. I want to show you, again, sort of our cool season forage yield response to shade. This is some work that was done in Virginia. So again, a little different environment. And we were looking at complex mixtures of cool season forages. And what you'll see, the top line on the left figure shows the production in 2016. So that this is annual, that's not annual forages, that's just over the entire year. And the second line is 2015. So these were newly established, and we imposed different shade treatments. And what you find is in this kind of general region of 30 to 40% shade, we have higher productivity or similar productivity to a spot with no shade. And what was interesting, if you look on the right graphic, you can see that this in a new planting, at that open shade, or excuse me, no shade open sun site, about 70% of the composition there was in weeds. So actually having shade actually benefited the establishment of these forages in year one. So there's some real potential value in having shade in the system for the forages. We did some looking at soil temperature in some of the early studies that we did with trees. And what you'll find is that when you have sort of moderate level of shade, you cool that environment down. And if you look at there are three lines here. The red top line is the low shade environment, and you can see the soil temperatures are highest there. And then you have kind of a green, it's a little bit harder to see. Soil temperatures are lower under that highest level of shade, which, okay, that seems sensible. And then the pink line represents kind of what's optimal or ideal for cool season forages. Just as an example, for some of the benefit here, Buren Lanier is over in the Wilmington area, has a pine-based silvopasture. He has changed his forage base to, I think, Bahia grass at this point in that silvopasture, but historically he grew fescue. And he said, I could not grow fescue in this environment without those trees. It's just a function of the trees buffering the system. A lot of people say, what about moisture? I said, well, the data kind of depend. It kind of depends on the environmental conditions. If you have a really dry period, if it's excessive, the tree and the grass may be competing. But if it's moderately dry, oftentimes the trees will help keep moisture in the system by shading and reducing evapotranspiration. So it's kind of an it depends scenario. And that's also dependent on species and that sort of thing. So, say, okay, this is all well and good, Fike, but what's it mean productivity wise? These trees from this study in 2002, when it was extremely dry, they were 7 years old. In 2003, we had an extremely wet year. And you can see the size of these are kind of young honey locust trees. We were looking at different tree density and slope position. And what we found was with honey locust and black walnut, 2-year average, we had about 15 to 16% greater forage production under those kind of moderately spaced trees. So, that was really what got me intrigued by these systems. And well, we can increase productivity of the understory forage. That's fantastic. Well, let's jump ahead to, whatever this was, let's say 2020 or something. These are, at this point, about 19-year-old honey locust trees on your left and black walnut on your right. So the trees are much larger. They're casting much more shade. They're competing for more nutrients and that sort of thing. And what we found is this is an average of 3 years of study, or excuse me, it's not an average. It shows you 3 years of study. The black walnut bars in the black had lower forage production. Systems with honey locust had equal production or even a little bit greater. So those trees were not as large. They may actually be putting other nutrients back into the system. So it's a benefit for the forage understory with the honey locust trees. So I said, well, that's terrible. You lost out on that black walnut. And maybe we'll get to that. We do see changes in forage composition under these trees. And with the black walnut, it's not all milk and cookies, as it were. It's not all beautiful, but we do see some reduction in tall fescue, which it would be infected. And we do see some increase in bluegrass, which is highly nutritious. But you say, well, you tanked your red clover. But, these are some of the things that are going to happen in these systems over time. Now, what does that mean for animal performance? If you look across the systems, we have to lower the stocking rate for that lower forage amount in the black walnut systems. And what we see is that average daily gain across time is as good or better in those kind of equalized, they're kind of equalized by available forage. And we look at total animal output for all of these systems, and these are summer grazing studies. We see total output is comparable across these 3 different systems. And what's going on there? I like to use the analogy, if I were giving you a buffet and I said you can have 100% of the all-you-can-eat buffet outside in the full sun when it's 90 degrees, or I'll give you 70% of the all-you-can-eat buffet, but you can eat inside, where do you think you're going to choose to go? And in which set of conditions or environments do you think you're more likely to gain weight? So what happens is those animals that have access to shade are going to utilize it. You see the black and the yellow dots. much greater shade utilization. There's a little bit of shade that comes into the open pasture system. The black walnut animals did graze a little bit more because forages are a little bit more limiting. But what's really interesting here is that those animals, like those earlier studies, they're changing their time budget. They spend more time resting. They're lying down more, they're standing less, and that spares energy. And we also have data that shows, animals that are on these silvopastures. If you look at the graph on the right, the top line is body temperature through the day of animals on open systems, and they're much warmer through the day. That's let's say we'll call that about 1.5 degrees or more of centigrade. So 2 or 3 degrees or more warmer, hotter than the animals in the silvopasture systems. And the lower table is a little hard to see, but we're measuring cortisol in those animals as well. And the animals that are out in the silvopastures have lower cortisol levels, meaning they're less stressed. And if you've got tall fescue, shade is critical for animals in those systems. And this is just a picture of animals that were on non-toxic fescue versus toxic fescue on a mild summer day, probably low 80s in Virginia. And our animals, so we're spending a lot of time on environmental issues, trying to keep cattle out of streams. And I think it's really driven by animals consuming toxic fescue. So these are data from Missouri that point to the value of shade for cattle. And it's very interesting. If you look at the first two lines, you've got infected fescue without shade or with shade. And to go from no shade to shade, they put pregnant animals out on these systems. You went from 38% calving to 88% calving. That's not changing the toxins. That's just providing respite, relief from the heat for those cattle. And you say, well, this isn't real world fight. I say, well, this is correct. This is a research study, but this points to what our producers do. They let their cattle have access to streams or woodlands. They get shade and they have higher reproductive performance. What's really intriguing to me is that the calf crop is greater with adding shade on toxic fescue than it is on just having cows on non-toxic fescue with no shade. And of course, when you look at calf performance, as you add shade into these systems and move to non-toxic fescue, you get a greater calf performance. So, this is placing us. We're in Virginia, in blue outline here. You're down in South Carolina, most of you. I keep telling people South Carolina is coming to us. These are what we're seeing in terms of changes in climate patterns or temperatures. And this is Climate Central did some analysis, and parts of Virginia have 30 to 60 more growing days in our neck of the woods since 1970. There's some estimates, there's some models out there that say where we're coming from Charleston. This is Charleston, West Virginia. I was giving this talk to some people a while back. In 60 years, it might feel like you live in Mississippi, or I guess this is Alabama in this case. So if we don't address these issues, we're going to have some real challenges. The question gets back to, do people want trees in pastures? And I would argue that, yeah, maybe not, but many of them want shade. And I would argue that planting trees that can appreciate in value would be far better than spending a lot of money on portable shade systems that are quite expensive and are going to depreciate. So I'm going to show you a few examples of what producers are doing in Virginia and their motivations. So this farmer in the middle is thinning individual trees to create silvopasture, and he's largely doing it for heat stress abatement as well as timber management. This is another producer's approach. He cut out wide wide alleys out of an existing pine stand, and then got that cleaned up and got his fescue stand in between there, and said his cattle do quite well in that environment during the summertime. So this is kind of southern Piedmont. This guy did some thinning of hardwood stands, and I call it a successful failure because you can see the trees he over-thinned, and they've experienced some stress, and you can see that in this picture. But then He went back another time and worked with a consulting forester, conducted a successful timber sale, and has gotten some greater management in this place to establish silvopasture. Many of you may have people who have access to pine plantations. This is a former student who created his own silvopasture. He didn't have a lot of money, so what he would do is go in and do select thinning on his own. He had portable fencing systems. He would put goats in there. They were eating the invasives that were in that pine stand. He broadcast seed and would use strategic use of fire, and was getting a forage understory underneath that. And because he had the opportunity for sort of long rotations, he never had parasite issues or that sort of thing. And so he's looking at this from a production standpoint, from an environmental restoration standpoint, and of course he liked it as part of his fitness plan. Buck Holsinger is up in the Valley of Virginia, and he's planted with tubes, and he says, you know, I'm looking for two-story agriculture. I was listening to Buck talk earlier this week. He said, I used to think I was a grass farmer. I thought I was a cow farmer. Then I thought I was a grass farmer. He said, now I think I'm a tree farmer, and I'm using the trees to protect and buffer the forages, and also to protect and buffer the cattle. And, you know, from a marketing perspective, he says, my customers get it, because he's direct selling his stuff. And I think I have some other pictures from his place in just a little bit. Well, here's one. This is how Buck approached. He's got an odd piece of ground. He said, I sat down at a table with Farm Map, and I just started thinking, what will I do with this? How will I put these in place? And he started laying it out. And then he came back and said what trees he wanted. And this is the map that he gave to the custom contractors who put the system in place for him. Mr. Milton Napier here on your left, the top left picture. He's been doing this because he's thinking about this as a second career and an opportunity for intergenerational land transfer. He's trying to improve the value of his land to pass on to his heirs. Other people have more resources, and think about this is something to do for hunting or for beef. This is a twin row loblolly pine system in Southern Virginia. Others are all about the aesthetics. I've had one producer tell me that he rents some property on, or rents some housing on his property. And he says, I'm sure that I get higher rental rates for that just because of the beauty of the silvopastures that they drive past. Others people are going to be looking for something different, and this engineer was one of those. This is some of how he laid it out and some of what's going on at his site now. Black locusts have done quite well. Again, he's a little. We have fewer people probably working with hardwoods, but there are more and more of them that are doing that. Species diversity, community engagement, wetland protection for Dana Beagle here, somebody in Southwest Virginia. I want to throw out an idea. While a lot of the work that I'm doing is trying to get people to plant trees and systems and manage for that, I wanted to throw out an idea about reclamation. One of my colleagues says silvopasture is a gateway drug in that I can get people engaged with silvopasture, and then they can start thinking about forest management. This is a site from New York. The extension forester is a guy named Brett Chedzoy. He has silvopastures in New York on his home family farm, and in Argentina on his wife's farm there. What Brett did is this is what our farm looked like in 2004. So if you've got people that you work with, or if you've got land you have access to that's full of invasive species, and there's a lot of questions about what about regeneration in these systems. You have cattle introduced into these systems, that's going to be a problem. Look, there's no regeneration here that's of any value, right? Let's be honest about that. It's full of invasive species. So, this is Brett's comment. Keep the livestock out of the woods so they don't eat the regeneration. Really? Come on. So what he did was he brought in a forest mulcher and cleaned out a bunch of the junk and got seed back into the environment and brought his cattle back in. And at this point, this was 4 years after he did that, he had a lot of black locust trees and maybe some other species as well. The black locusts are quite valuable to him as, a pole or post crop that he can sell. And this is another image. sorry about that, adjacent plantation head high with invasives before he started grazing. So we can use animals as tools. We can use other tools to clean up some of these sites that are degraded and make better value from them. Now, probably the kind of last piece I should really speak to here, and I said this earlier, the one fundamental piece about silvopastures, because it's very difficult to be prescriptive because of the different environments, the different tree species that are adapted to those environments, the different livestock species, livestock classes. I got pictures from Alabama. A guy sent me, forester, conservation specialist, had a bull walking down, it was probably at least 4-inch diameter pine tree. Just want to scratch his belly and testicles, and that's kind of a hard thing to do for a tree to tolerate. So a calf's not going to do that. Mama cow's not going to do that. So we have to think about, again, all of the components of the system and how do I manage them? And what are their interactions likely to be? And so this person from Mississippi was saying intensive management is key to this system. And so, when we go to work with producers, if they're not already using rotational grazing methods, we're going to have to spend time talking to them about, getting them up to speed with something like that before we start talking about, adding trees into the system. And that said, some of these approaches don't have to be that challenging, perhaps. Again, this is an example of some pine trees we had at a research station where we had stockers in with them, and they did a little bit of damage to the trees, but nothing life-threatening. And over time, that stand will be just fine. If we had bulls or large animals, might be a different story. And so thinking about these dynamics is important, but it may be worth just sticking the trees in the ground and managing without a whole lot of protection in this context, rather than putting in a lot of fencing and having to work with that to protect the trees. Hardwood trees are a little more particular, and I think are a little more demanding perhaps in terms of protection. And you'll see a lot of people that use tubes. I mentioned Buck Holsinger earlier. Buck says, I don't want to fool with tubes anymore. I'll just kind of let weeds grow up and protect them. The cows don't seem to bother them as much with some of the weeds and stuff around them. But, some people don't want to fool with that. This producer doing something very interesting. She uses a 6-foot tube with a fiberglass stake, and then she puts a hot wire across the tube so the cows can actually run or walk underneath this hot line. And if she wants to use it as a fence, she can lower it down on the tube. So she's integrated the tree protection with the fencing. And because she has a hot wire that runs down the tube, they don't push on that, use it as a scratching post or that sort of thing. I would encourage you, I should have included some examples from Georgia and Alabama. I would encourage you to take a picture of this web link. You can also find it on our Virginia Tech Silvopasture page. But if you go to this web link, you'll find something like 13 different producer stories of people doing silvopasture in Virginia, Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee. And this is, these are images that come out of the video for Win Miller there in Tennessee. And there's also a couple of additional videos that just talk about some of the producer challenges and some of the benefits that the producers are seeing. A number of people, I mentioned climate earlier in terms of temperature, a number of people, organizations are seeing silvopastures as a way to, in effect, offer a natural climate solution for climate change issues, drawing down carbon. There's a project or a group of people that call themselves Project Drawdown, and among the agricultural systems that can be deployed and management practices that can be deployed to improve carbon or remove carbon from the atmosphere, silvopasture is considered one of the best. And so there are a number of entities out there that are now working on these systems. And that's all I got. I'll stop there for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fike. So right now we're open for questions. I'm just gonna start with a couple that came while you were presenting, Dr.
Okay.
Fike. So while you're talking about, in one of your slides, you had some black walnut there. So
Yep.
Mr. Franklin is asking, black walnut has allelopathic properties. Is that a factor in the difference in forage production that you saw on your study?
It's really hard for us to tease that out. Um, because well, it's hard to tease that out. When you start looking at allelopathy, it takes a lot of science is deeper than what I do to discern that. The question that's been in my mind is, do we see this as an allelopathic effect or is it a shade effect? The walnut trees are larger. They have a denser canopy. If you ever read Dr. Seuss, he talks about the truffula tree. If you know what a truffula tree is, I mean, they look like big pom-poms on stems sometimes. I mean, that's after we prune them. As they're growing out, they're getting bigger, more wider canopy. They're just casting more shade. So it could be somewhat of an allelopathic effect. It could be the shade effect. I tend to think it's a little bit of both. And my hypothesis would be that the allelopathy, it's not stopping us from having clover. In fact, we can see a fair amount of clover in these systems, but it probably slows the clover productivity down, as does the shade, quite frankly. And with less productive legumes, we have less nitrogen in the system, which means that our cool season forages are less productive. We're not doing, sort of differential fertilization from one system to another, trying to keep all of that the same. And so, I just think that our forages are not quite as productive in the system in part because the legumes are less productive. Seemed like there's one other comment I was going to make relative to that, but well, one thing that I would say is with the walnut system, we can manage around that. We could have lower density walnuts, or we might intersperse, say, black locust that's got a smaller crown and it's going to put nitrogen back into the system. So there's an opportunity to have more diverse systems from the tree perspective. But when these studies were established 30 years ago, almost, they just did a single species in each system.
Okay, thank you. So one other question that we have on the chat. So Mrs. Robertson is asking, she's sort of like building upon the previous question. So black locust is a legume. So do you think this helps with forage production, sort of what you're talking about?
Yeah, in fact, I probably should have shown you some other slides. I do think that it adds nitrogen into the system, and some of those earlier studies that I pointed to would indicate that as well. But I would say black locust, particularly, it can also serve as a forage resource. I have some images in some other presentations I didn't include today from the Holsinger farm, and he does what's called a hinge cut because he wants a nice straight tree. Well, if it's got a branch here, he'll cut the top, and that branch will fall down, but it won't break all that cambium layer away from the bark, and so he can still get nutrients out to the leaf tissue. And over a summer, his cows will browse that a couple of times, and then when that finally is done, he'll just cut that limb off. And these are small diameter, so it's not a big chore, but he'll cut that limb off and let it fall to the ground, and they'll trample it in. It'll be a source of soil carbon, and it will also kind of help keep the cows away from the stem base a little bit, so there's less impact on the root systems. And we have some evidence. It's not not conclusive, but we have some evidence here from some other work that we're doing that tannins in forages can negate some of the effects of fescue toxins. And so his cattle are on essentially 100% toxic tall fescue. And he said they really relish these leaves with tannins in them, and particularly in the summertime when that stuff is actively growing.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is by Mr. Hermson. So you mentioned that you have seen greater overall plant biomass productivity when integrating trees with forages. Has research been done evaluating the how a diverse forage stand affects biomass production versus a monoculture forage stand?
Yeah, so that's maybe a little bit outside the context of silvopasture per se, but the answer is yes, greater diversity in general is associated with higher productivity. You've got different root architectures, you have different phenology, so plants that are growing at different times and taking advantage of the resources. When you have a stress event and you have one species and it's sensitive to that stress, then the whole system is shut down. Whereas if you have multiple species with different sensitivities, let's say alfalfa or chicory with deep root systems can capture water when other forage species cannot. So to answer your question very briefly, yes, diversity is a good thing.
Okay. And then Dr. Halloran just mentioned that nitrogen fixation is especially beneficial for C3 forages at that time.
Well, it's beneficial for C4s as well, certainly. The C4s are more nitrogen use efficient, but if you looked at Bermuda grass or other C4 species, they like nitrogen. And they will be quite productive with it. I mean, we have a whole bunch of research just on how much and when to apply nitrogen fertilizers to Bermuda grass, hayfields, and pastures. So it's not just the C3s that like nitrogen.
Mm-hmm. Then we have one more question. So Mrs. Copterson is saying, I've read that honey locust doesn't fix as much nitrogen as black locust. Is that true?
What doesn't fix as much nitrogen as black locust?
Honey locust.
Oh, that probably is true. Honey locust is an intriguing plant. And I haven't read about this lately, but the last reading I did on this, there was some suggestion that it's a more primitive legume. It does not nodulate. And so, but it has high levels of nitrogen beyond what you might expect. And so, where's that nitrogen coming from? Are there microbial root associations that we're just not aware of? And again, I don't know where the research stands on that at this point, but yes, it does not nodulate, probably does not fix as much nitrogen. But one of the things we observe is that we have high levels of legume productivity oftentimes in our honey locust stands. So it will accommodate species like red clover. And so that's not been, I mean, we're looking at these systems primarily from their productivity, animal performance, forage production. We do look at some composition stuff. But we haven't gone deep into, nitrogen fixation by these different trees. But that does not, and we don't have a way to compare at this point, say black locust with honey locust. But you're generally right. I'd say that the honey locust we would anticipate would have lower levels of nitrogen fixation.
Okay, thank you. At this point, we're just gonna ask you if you have a question to unmute yourself and ask. Does anybody have any questions? Well,
so I got a question. Is this crazy? Does anybody want trees in pastures? And I realize I could have done a better job thinking about this in a South Carolina or Southern coastal plain context, but
no, you did a good job, Dr. Fike.
Well,
very useful information.
I see Mr. Noble, he kind of grinned when I said, this is crazy. And I'm not sure whether that's a grin of like, yeah, I'm not going to admit it out loud or what that means. But, I've spent a career on this essentially. Maybe I was crazy, but I think that it has real potential. The issue again is how do we get producers to manage?
Mhm. And Dr. Fike, just before I let you go, I just wanted to ask you to touch a little more in a couple of topics, if you
Uh,
don't mind.
oh, okay. I'll do my best.
So I know you have a lot of experience both on the working on research sites, but also helping producers to get their farms going and
Hmm.
establishing their
Hmm.
their sites. So if you could just let us know like some of the major considerations if I'm wanting to establish a silvopasture system
Yeah,
that I
yeah,
should take in consideration.
yeah. I was pulling slides from two or three different slide sets today, and Liliana, and I'm sorry, I had some stuff about considerations, um, and they didn't make it in, and that's just an oversight on my part. So, the first question is, what are your circumstances? What are your motivations? What are your goals? And I would say this too, for those of you who are producers who are thinking, well, this guy's nuts, but I could try some of this. One of my friends says, take the 10 tree challenge. Can you take a couple of species or whatever you think you're interested in and plant about 10 trees of them? Don't try to go out and plant 10 acres and watch the whole thing fail. Just go plant 10 trees and see if you can make them work or not. What works, what doesn't work. And think about your system. Are you in a deep sand? Are you on a red clay? Where are you going to be growing these trees? What trees are adapted to your site? What livestock are you trying to produce? I've got lots of people that want to do goats, and that's great. But if you're going to do goats, then you either need to think about a tree that they don't really have any particular preference for, or you need to think about, well, I may need to be a little more aggressive at implementing protection, right? I mean, fencing might work, but I may even have to put a cage around them, something like that. A quick story on honey locust trees. They were planted in 1995, and at the time they planted trees 8 feet apart. And every fifth tree was a grafted tree that produces a pod that's got lots of sugar in it. And my colleague that got me into this thing said the deer went to every one of those grafts and girdled the tree. The deer could tell that was a high sugar tree, and they left the common types alone. And so, you got to think about, is this tree going to be palatable or not? And if so, how do I protect it? If you're going back into a pasture system, you've got to think about reducing the competition there. So, some sort of herbicide treatment, or mulch, or both, that sort of thing. There are all these things that you want. Somebody said that this give them some ideas for their pecans and loblollies. Yeah, and both very different types of trees are going to take different types of management. But the pecan silvopasture system is certainly doable, and you'll see in the Missouri, places like that, they're doing more black walnut, but the pecan systems are certainly possible. So again, I can't be prescriptive, but you just have to think about, how do these components go together and interact? And what am I willing to do? What do I have time and energy to do in terms of tree establishment? One thing, many of you may think about planting several acres, and you might have a commercial operator to do that. It's important, I think, to develop something of an aftercare program where they come back in, or you have somebody that's coming back in to look at those trees, see if they're healthy, living, kind of, if there's evidence of animal damage, you need to get on that quickly. And so, I mean, I kind of mixing pieces here. There's an aftercare part where, a commercial operator could come in and help keep those trees going, stake stuff if it needs to be, or remove weeds or that sort of thing. But then there's your job too, which would be to look at these on a regular basis and make sure that you're not suffering from wildlife damage, or that, you run the cattle in, make sure that the cattle are not causing problems. You don't want to just say, well, they'll be all right, and I'll take a look at them, next month, and by that time it's a problem. So sorry, I'm not really answering the question. I'm saying you got to kind of work through some of those details on your own for the resources you have, and the things that the outcomes that you want. I will say this as well. NRCS is highly supportive, I think, not in all states, but there seems to be a growing interest in seeing these systems get implemented. And you may or may not have a good, I shouldn't say good, a knowledgeable technical service provider. But there are a lot of resources financially out there, and there's growing resources in terms of examples of how people are doing this successfully.
Sure, thank you. So Mr. Wade is asking, is there any research regarding using silvopasture and longleaf pine restoration?
I haven't seen that with longleaf pine. Restoration certainly would be possible, I think. The pines are, some people don't want to fool with longleaf because of, they're kind of variable coming out of the grass stage. And so it may take a little bit longer to get them up. But again, I think you could do that. You could certainly, and I don't know if I don't remember if it was longleaf or slash or which species exactly, but I have some example imagery from somebody had given me. I think it was actually longleaf. So I think that's the bottom line is I think that's very doable. It may take a different kind of time frame or a different set of inputs than say if you're planting loblolly, which some of my forester friends tell me will grow in a parking lot.
Sure. So the next question is, any issues with soil pH adjacent to the trees?
Soil pH, what, Liliane?
Next to the trees.
Um,
There you are. On the adjacent. My accent.
yeah, and forgive me, my ears don't always catch it exactly. So
right next to the trees.
One of the things that it's been interesting to me. We plant trees and we've got different demonstration sites, and sometimes you got a site that looks kind of rough. For us, rough might be low pH, low phosphorus, and blackberries and that kind of stuff will show up there. But sometimes we get a lot of broom sedge. And so, I don't encourage you to improve the pasture before you get the tree planted if you're in that kind of situation, because those low pH systems or soil conditions are, oftentimes not very bad for many of the tree species that you might plant. And if you've got lots of broom sedge that's growing up around that tree, then that's a buffer. The deer don't want to put their head through that stuff, so that can be protective. Buck Holsinger, I've mentioned him 2 or 3 times in his talk earlier this week. He said that he's now planting trees, black locust in particular, back into switchgrass fields. And he doesn't want to fool with tubes anymore. So that gives him some cover and protection for those seedling trees. But the switchgrass, the native grasses are well adapted to low soil pH. If you've got higher nutrient concentrations in soil, then you create environment or conditions that are more conducive for cool season or warm season forages for that matter. And that just means there's the potential for more competition. So if you don't have a high fertility site and you want to create silvopasture there, that's fine. Get the trees up and then, come back and do the renovation in the alleys or interspaces for your forage productions. That would be my general recommendation.
Sure. And the other point that I wanted to just maybe if you have some examples to mention something is more like on the ecosystem benefits that we can get with silvopasture systems, because I think this is one of the things that a lot of people are looking to enhancing sustainability on their farms nowadays. So do you want to just mention something?
Right. Well, and I didn't want to step on Bruno's toes here, but I will just say that these systems offer the opportunity to capture carbon, to support greater biodiversity within the soil. when we get out and work within the silvopasture, and I have graduate students out there working, in these systems, and they're like, we'll work in the silvopasture. You can do the stuff out in the open. There's a benefit to the human being interacting in that space, quite frankly. And I know people that are like, if I can manage in these systems, that's fantastic. And of course, maybe where you are, grassland birds are a real issue. And so, I don't say we have to put silvopasture on every acre. Because grassland birds need open sites. They don't need trees around them. But we, at the same time, we do see lots of bird species that we wouldn't see in our open systems. And our lands are kind of cut up. They're not necessarily the best suited for grassland birds, at least where I'm doing some of my research. So I don't feel like I'm hurting them, but I'm providing opportunity for other species. So I mentioned carbon. It's possible that those healthier and more comfortable animals are producing a better quality product. We haven't measured that at this point. And there may even be the potential benefits relative to sometimes when animals are more heat stressed. I think they can have higher methane emissions. So, we don't have all the data to say one way or another on that. But we do think of those as potential benefits. Certainly, we have a lot of historically have done a lot of riparian buffer plantings with trees. And so in this kind of context, silvopasture may be, a way to manage a riparian buffer. If those trees are out in leaf and you've got a big storm coming, you are going to slow those raindrops, and you can slow runoff to the ecosystem. And two, if you get into a big bad drought, I mean, I'm older than most of you here. I remember in '93 there was, 93 was the big flood in the Midwest. There was a big drought in the early '90s, I think. And, there used to be a lot of news stories at that time of producers that were cutting sycamore and poplar and cottonwood and things like that to feed their cattle. So a lot of these trees, can buffer the system from a temperature, from a moisture standpoint, but they also can buffer the system in terms of feed resources when you get into extreme weather. I didn't talk so much about cold. It's not something we worry about much in the Southeast, but there's a lot of energy lost by animals, that are out in an open field dealing with cold temperatures and wet weather and wind. And so you could plant trees, not maybe so much as silvopasture, but as shelter belts, to give them some protection from the elements that way. And that has a very high energy sparing effect.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Fike. We really appreciate all the information that you shared with us. So we're going to move forward with the second presentation for the day. So we now have Dr. Bruno Pedreira joining us. He's from University of Tennessee. So Dr. Pedreira received his master's and his PhD degrees from University of São Paulo. And then currently he's a associate professor and the director of the University of Tennessee Beef and Forage Center. Through his career, he has been involved in developing management practices for forage systems. He worked with modeling forage crop responses, and also he has been really involved with silvopasture systems in different types of systems, even in rotations. So I'm sure he's going to talk a little more about that. And Dr. Fike already alluded to this, but so Dr. Pedreira is going to be talking about environmental benefits and animal health benefits of using silvopasture systems. So Dr. Pedreira, thank you so much for being here with us today. The floor is yours.
Great, Liliane. Thank you so much for having me here. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Good, excellent. Thanks for the introduction. After Dr. Fike here, I'll do my best to do not overlap too much, but I would say that it'll be more like kind of watching a new movie with a different actor, right? We will go through basically the same stuff here, but with a little bit of different perspective. And I think every time we are talking about a such subject, most of our experience come with it, right? So I will try to share with you guys today more of my experience on this and try to share you what are my thoughts when I'm thinking about silvopasture systems. And also Liliane asked me to be more in the animal side of it and the environmental benefits on this. And that's where I will try to keep myself a little bit more here with you guys today. So John already gave me really nice, floor here. He set the ground with you guys. And as you guys can see, we have pretty much the same view in what we are calling silvopasture systems, right? It's not only such place that you just let the animals go in. We want to understand these as a truly system, a truly association among trees, pastures, animals, that we are targeting more than just increasing productivity. We want to see more ecosystem services. We want to see that sustainability coming with this whole thing, right? And also, when we talk about this, we need to understand that silvopasture systems, they have been proposed as a way to intensify livestock production systems, right? And everything that comes with this idea that we are going to get more or do more, it does not ever comes with the same idea that's going to be easier, right? I think that's a main thing here with silvopasture systems. As well as when we talk about rotational grazing instead of continuous grazing, when you decide to feed your animals with something different, it always requires from us to have a different perspective and to work different with that system. So with that said, John already mentioned as well, forage-based livestock systems and trees, we just do not start to work with it yesterday, right? It's a millennia-old practice. We have been doing it all over the world, in several countries, in several parts of the world. We know that from a long-term perspective. Here, especially in the Western US, we have a lot of numbers and people talking about it, especially about grazing woodlands since 1800s. So we have been doing this for a while. The point is, what we were doing 100 years ago and what exactly we are looking from now on when we are talking about silvopasture systems. And my understanding is, and if you go to the literature and try to read what we had there, written in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s in terms of silvopasture, it was basically woodland that we were trying to just bring animals in because grasses there were considered like weeds. So in order to fight weeds, we were releasing animals in the woods, right? And that was fine, and that still may be fine for some people nowadays if you just want to reduce the amount of forage you have in your woodland. But I think we have been discussing here to do something a little bit, better than this, a little bit more complex than this. And if you go and try to understand the potential impact of it in the US, you will find that we have more than 73 million acres of woodland in the whole US. So we can just turn animals in and use it a little bit, and that comes from the USDA census, from the last one we had here. And a third of that woodland, we have some animals grazing there. Just here in Tennessee, where I am at the University of Tennessee, for the whole state, we have more than 1 million acres in woodland, and we could be grazing part of it at least, and working on this area with a little bit more efficiency, rather than just having this as woodlands and going there every 10 years, 15, 20 years and take some money out of this, right? We can see that only in the state of Tennessee, we can beneficiate more than 28,000 farmers, that they have some woodland there and they could be able to use it if they did it in a more professional way, let's put it this way. And then, okay, assuming that we have it, assuming that we can do things like this, assuming that all of these may be helpful, I think the main question is the why. Why am I going to go into these woods, right? Why I'm going to get in trouble like this? So I'm also the 5th generation of livestock farmers in my family. So every time I'm thinking about silvopasture systems, I'm always thinking also under the animal perspective. Is it better for them? How much does it, does it help me in terms of growing more livestock or making in order of create an environment that will be better for my animals? So shade for livestock is the first thing that comes to my mind when I'm thinking about silvopasture systems. We can also include in it, increasing species richness, diversity of products, and at the end of the day, try to get a greater utilization of the existing farm woodland, but also be able to better work in my forage production when I'm thinking with a livestock mindset. Okay. With that said, silvopasture systems are considered an alternative to the traditional, right? Well, what can we call traditional? That specialized systems that we have in terms of beef, grains, or milk production. So silvopasture system here we'll try to combine product and ecological diversification. I think that's the main thing. We are going into a second level. We are getting out of the monoculture of trees or the monoculture of forage that we are using for livestock. And now we are bringing that diversification. We are bringing a new system to the table that will be need to be thinking and how you balance out things here. Am I leaning more towards my livestock? Am I leaning towards my forest? Because my understanding is that if you were working with silvopasture systems, you may be able to lean towards livestock or lean towards forest a little bit. And at the end of the day, we all want to pay the bills, right? My mindset is always a little bit livestock driven than more tree driven here. So when I'm thinking about what can I do in order to build my silvopasture system and create something good there, the first thing I want to find as a good reason to do it is heat stress, right? I think that's the why here. How can I handle heat stress? And John just showed to you guys the weather maps there and how the weather has been changing. And you may be in Virginia with an Alabama weather in maybe in a decade, in 20 years. I don't know where we are going with this kind of weather changing thing. But heat stress has been causing problems in several places all around the world, right? And when we think about beef or dairy cattle, we want to have our animals from 41 to 77 degree Fahrenheit. Every time we are below this or above this, that's the optimal range. When we go out of the range, we have our animals growing, being raised in a situation that is not ideal for them, right? And how does it matter? It matters because when we have high temperatures, the animals will not be performing as they are supposed to be. And they will be under what we call heat stress. And it will depend, first of all, in the environmental factors that we have there. And shade is one of the things that we need to think about it. Access to water, relative humidity, what kind of diet these animals are going through. So all of these things put it together will help us to understand a little bit on how to, the heat stress is stressing my animals at a point that I'm losing money instead of being making money. Before I moved to Tennessee, I worked in Kansas for almost 3 years. And one of the things that I didn't find there was trees, right? There is no trees in Kansas and just very few there. And I had summers there that we lost animals in some of the properties I was working with some of the farmers, and they kind of consider it kind of normal within the system because it's, July is hot, some of the animals may not be adapted. My question here is if you were losing a single animal for heat stress, that animal is dead, okay? It's dying due heat stress. How many animals are you having that are not performing well because they are under heat stress? The death is just the end of the process, right? And sometimes we will face it, but we are not realizing how many other animals we are having there with so much stress that they are not performing as they are supposed to be performing for you. So just to have an idea in terms of water requirements, if you go from 70 to 90 Fahrenheit in terms of weather and environmental temperature or ambient temperature, you can increase 38% just the water requirement for that as such animal. So if water is not available, if they don't have enough that animals can take it, it's another issue, right? So yeah, let's make clear that we understand that environment takes a lot when we are talking about livestock. And if affect the animals, if affect the way the animals are being raised there, it will also affect the reproductive efficiency. And that's what we have a lot in the southern U.S. from Tennessee up to Florida, right? Going through all of the Carolinas and Georgia and Alabama. We have a lot of the cow-calf operation of the whole country is here and around us. So if you think that 35 to 50% of a beef cattle can fail to become pregnant after the first insemination, and from 50 to 70% in terms of dairy, it tells a lot to us, okay? So reproductive efficiency, it is a major challenge. And you can find a lot of reasons to justify why you're having a fail insemination. But I can tell you, there is a lot of these that is body temperature related. Animals under a lot of stress, under a lot of heat, running in pastures without trees or in situations that they do not have any access to shade, they may be even more in trouble. So if you think in a week with a 7-day forecast like this from 70s to 90s, you can imagine the amount of heat stress that we are going to have, elevated body temperature, either for cows or heifers. And we have data, for example, telling us that when we go from 70 to 90 Fahrenheit, you can see the pregnant rate coming from more than 50% to lower than 15%. So yes, how can I also look at a silvopasture system and say, yes, I understood everything that John said. It's great to the environment. It's great to the whole system overall. But it is really amazing for all of the animals that are being raised in there, right? When we think about being challenged with temperatures, you can see that either for cows and bulls, we can impact a lot of, some parts of the reproductive tract for cows. It can change your embryo transfer rates. You can impact all of this. And when we're thinking about the males, when we're thinking on the bulls, it impairs sperm production, sperm morphology, motility. It can change the viability of artificial insemination just because these animals are under a lot of heat stress. So if I can build a new system that helps me to improve my pregnancy rate, would be great as well, right? It's kind of a result of a system. I'm building a system that will help me to do better with my livestock when we are thinking about the environment that these animals are there. And that's, again, if we can manage in a way that we do not allow the temperatures for these animals to go above 100, 101, we will be able to have really better pregnancy outcomes out of these systems. Because every time we have our animals here, and you can see in these there, with temperatures above 102, 103, we can get close to virtually zero pregnancy rate because everything in terms of cow and bull related will not be working well. And in these circumstances, the importance of shade will be highly appreciated, right? We can have shades and we can make animals do much better in this condition. If we change a little bit the gears from the beef to the dairy livestock, it's not uncommon for us to find pictures like this, right? With animals with the whole tongue outside, open mouth, trying to ventilate at some point to find a better place to go. And that everything impacts milk production and reproductive aspects. Productions and fertility will be gone quicker and quicker. And it causes a lot of issues to the animal because under that kind of heat stress, the first thing that the animals will do is to stop to graze, stop to eat. So dry matter intake will be reduced. They will go into negative energy balance. The animals will not be productive at all. It's going to impact all of the hormones. It's going to impact estrus expression and quality oocytes, which in the end of the day may result in a lot of subfertility or infertility in our animals. Good. So how understanding that it can be bad like this, and sometimes we are not taking care of these as we are supposed to be, knowing that there is a huge effect in fertility, affecting females and males from ovulations to sperm viability. So what can we do to protect our animals against temperature extremes, winds, and radiation, right? Because when we have the animals a little bit more protected, a little bit more sheltered, they will use better their metabolism energy. They will not need to be controlling that much body temperature. And every time you need to regulate your body temperature a lot, you may end up spending much more energy just to be alive rather than spend that energy to produce a calf or to produce more beef or more milk for you. Every time you have our animals, well protected again with access to shade, they will have a better immune system. They will be able to deal better with any kind of disease and stress. And what we know is that if you have animals that have access to trees, for example, and under those trees, you may have up to less 80% radiation, and the temperature can have a difference in 14, 15 degree Fahrenheit if you are under the tree or in the open pasture, getting direct radiation from the sun, right? So it's kind of a few points here that highlights to us the importance of taking care of all of it. And we will find data on the literature to support all of it. I found a few studies that were recently published that can share with you guys, that I want to share with you guys today. And here you can see the Black Globe Humidity Index and the Heat Load Index. Those are two indexes we use to measure environmental benefits to animals. And you can see the black line is in a conventional rotational system, and the gray line is a silvopasture system. And you can see that the gray line is always below it, right? So we have a lower index in terms of black globe humidity, and we have lower numbers as well when we are talking about heat load index. It makes the silvopasture systems a system that we want to be there, right? John already mentioned that some of his students, some of them want to take samples on the silvopasture while the other one are taking samples on the open pasture, right? We all want to be under the shade at some point. The same group of researchers here, they were evaluating as well the cortisol levels and the body weight effect when you were in the same both systems, in a single rotational grazing systems or under a silvopasture system. And you can see again, cortisol levels were lower when we are in silvopasture systems, as well the body weight response. So the body weight was kept higher when we are in the silvopasture system. What exactly does it mean to us? It means that we have animals here in a much less stressed condition, and for that reason, they did not lose weight. They were able to use their energy instead of being just burning that energy to regulate body temperature. They were using that thing to keep themselves in a good way in the silvopasture system. So being steady with the body weight tells a lot to us. And if you understand a little bit about reproductive side, you see that the cows that were losing weight here, we have much less chance to get a new pregnancy and give you a new calf next year. So they kind of wrap up this study telling us that if you can reduce this temperature, if you can give this kind of shade to the animals, we will have overall lower heart rate, lower respiratory rate, lower rectal and body surface, lower cortisol levels. And everything put together will end up giving us a better dry matter intake, which will result in better daily gain performance, right? And good body weight. But also, when you go into the reproductive side, we can have a higher embryo recovery. So especially for high-value animals, having access to shade, that tells a lot to us. But not only in the heat side here, it's a problem. When we go into the cold side, silvopasture systems can also help us, right? So shelter from trees can offer thermal protection for livestock during the winter by reducing wind and by reducing precipitation reaching sheltering animals. So if you need to be outside in a snow day, you'd rather be in a sheltered place, right? We'd rather be under a tree because everything will be a little bit better there. So both ways, if you are in a very heat stress situation or in a cold stress situation, having trees in the pastures will make livestock life a little bit easier. So good, animal welfare. But Bruno, how much does it can affect as well animal behavior? John already mentioned a little bit, and we have this other study here that I want to share with you guys. And they were measuring grazing, rumination, and idle activity in these animals in a silvopasture systems. And they found out something that I think that is very interesting. The first thing was, to graze, to be able to fulfill the rooming, they spend like 80% of their time grazing in a sunny area because most of the pasture here was sunny and they have some shade, they have access to shade. So they were able to graze 20% of the time in a shady area. But in order to fulfill their requirements, they were grazing everywhere. However, when they were ruminating or in idle or just in social activities, you can see that they spend 85% of their time ruminating under the shade and 65% of the whole socialization activities that livestock you will have under the shade of the trees as well. What is the message here, right? And that's what I like to see when I'm looking at data like this. I think the main message here is cows are telling us that yes, if I don't have shade, well, if I need to graze, I'm going everywhere to get my rumen fulfilled. But as soon as I get it done, I will ruminate and I will do nothing under the shade of the tree so I can save some energy. I can do my best in this situation. Because cows are picky, right? They know what they are doing. They kind of evolved together with forage in the last few millennia. And knowing that, they will also use trees, if they have access to them, as fodder, as forage. And that's a video of one of the farmers I work in the semi-arid of Brazil. And in the semi-arid area, you have lack of forage for a few months of the year. So especially if you are working with silvopasture systems in regions where weather can be challenging, and John already mentioned a little bit about this, the animals may be able to graze it as well, and silvopasture can bring to you a second source of feed in your system, especially if we are going through very different environmental situations. So great, I can improve reproductive aspects, I can improve animal welfare, either in the cold or in the heat stress. Animals will be grazing anywhere, but they will be ruminating under the shade. If they are in a situation that they need an extra forage, they will be looking for the trees to get something else. But the main thing as well is trees in silvopasture systems can produce products to increase enterprise diversification. I will be able to have a second business now, right? We were livestock farmers, now we were talking about forages, and now we are talking about trees. So we're kind of building layers in my system that will help me to make more money, to be able to be a little bit more profitable, and having the idea that I'm bringing sustainability to the whole thing. Yeah. So when I bring trees to the system, I need to think about other products that I can sell and other things that can be beneficiating myself. And then we will start to go into a part that, okay, it's gonna bring that tree to the system. We're going to bring that tree to the system. It may bring value, but it may also bring a negative impact to livestock, because if I have too much, I may reduce the amount of forage I'm producing. And, if I have 100 cows now, if I start to add a lot of trees, I may not be able to have 100 cows. I may need to down it, to go down a little bit, go to 95, 90, 80, 70 cows. I don't know. It depends on how many trees do you want to have there. But finding this balance with I think that's to me is the main thing here in a silvopasture system. Because when we are trying to find that balance, we also need to remember that most of the conversation around the world nowadays is that livestock is responsible for almost 15% of the total global greenhouse gas emissions. And we need to find a way to work with sustainable strategies to mitigate this enteric methane that we have been emitting worldwide. And the beauty on this is we are starting to have new studies and new research that have been bringing that has been bringing up to us new numbers that will help us to work on this. So I really like this picture here that we can see, emissions from the soil, emissions from the crop, emissions from the animals, emissions from the tractors. But also, by adding trees, we can uptake carbon. We can bring it back to the system. And we can make the case to work with our livestock systems, trying to convince people that, yes, we are not destroying the whole world. We are not here just to get rid of everything and destroy the next generation. We do care about this. We do understand that we have emissions, but we do understand that we can mitigate them and we can work better to do our best in terms of silvopasture systems. And that study here, it was published this year in 2024, brand new one. You can see that in this study, these researchers, they were working with livestock, silvopasture, crop livestock systems, and crop livestock forage systems. So the whole three components together. And they were evaluating the total greenhouse gas emissions, the total carbon sequestration, and the net carbon balance. And that's what I want you guys to pay attention with me. So yes, we do have emissions, right? We are emitting there as we are producing. If we have animals, we are emitting carbon dioxide, we are emitting methane. But when we're thinking about the potential of carbon sequestration, and here you can see in the silvopasture system and in the crop livestock forage system, we have the two highest carbon sequestration, and it brings us a really nice balance here. And it puts the silvopasture system with the best net carbon balance. So I don't know if carbon credits and carbon markets going to be something in 20 years, but if it becomes, and if in 10 or 15 or 20 years, somebody, instead of selling livestock or beef and milk, we need to be selling carbon, thinking about silvopasture systems right now may be a nice thing to have in your farm, and maybe in 20 years, the next generation of farmers will be in good shape. Good. I almost talked too much with you guys. I think that will be my main message when I'm talking in my 30,000 feet view here of the whole system. I want you guys to understand that I have environmental benefits. I can change a lot in terms of what I'm offering to my animals, in terms of animal welfare, in terms of animal behavior. We can make a better system. The point I want to go towards the end of my presentation right now is, okay, I like it, Bruno. I'm sold. How can I do this? Well, what should I think from now on? Okay. And that works for everything in life, right? Planning. Where you are and where you want to go. And you need to answer a few questions to yourself. What's your current situation? What you want for your system as a goal? And how can you get there? Because each of us has a different pace. Each of us has a different goal. And maybe the silvopasture system that you visit from your neighbor does not work for you because you have a different perspective of your system. So I like to say that when you're talking about silvopasture systems, you will find people with three different views. You will find people they just want ecosystem service. They are okay with it. They just want to put a few trees there, and whatever they get from that trees, they are happy with. You will find people that want to have a second source of income. So they want to add something to the system because they want to have another income, but they don't want to lose what they have right now. And then you find a third type of farmer that they want to add trees, and they are willing to replace some of what they are building in terms of livestock in trees, and they will allow the trees to take so much that the livestock may be a little bit lower in terms of revenues, but both together will give to them even better. And John already made it clear with you guys, right? So let's go through those three kinds of views here for silvopasture systems. In this first one, as I mentioned, who else is working with silvopastures towards ecosystem services? I think the main thing here is to provide shade. I want to see my animals benefited of this shade and producing a little bit better. But we may also bring nitrogen fixation. We were discussing here a little bit. John already answered a few questions in the legume trees here. They may be bringing some nitrogen to our conversation. They may be helping us with soil chemical and soil physical characteristics. We may be, well, with trees, we'll be exploring soil layers that we'll never be exploring only with forests, right? We may have forests there a few feet down, but trees will be much deeper than the forest, bringing nutrients from down on the deep layers to the top layers again throughout the whole cycling that we have every year, especially with the trees that will put leaves down every winter, right? Trees will help us with water infiltration, to recharge the water we need in the soil. So I can live with a silvopasture system that will be focused on the ecosystem services. That will be bringing to me a lot of benefits. And just by adding them there and having shade, I will have all of the animal benefits that I already mentioned to you guys. And then we took pictures, for example, from this cow grazing in a pasture during the summertime. And you can see in the back of the cow, the temperature, especially in the black parts, it can go above 115 Fahrenheit. So would you rather to have your back with 116 Fahrenheit, or would you rather to be under a shade of a tree grazing the hottest part of the day? Okay, that's what you can see in terms of benefits to the animals. And if you look for the whole thing with this ecosystem service perspective, if you look at the same picture using the same thermal camera, you can see temperatures going from 85 here under the shade up to 132 in the bare ground. So that's a lot. That's really high. And it changes all the microorganisms in the soil. It will have a lot of effects in the whole microbiome we have in the soil, right? So if you want to have this ecosystem service perspective, all of these things will be there for you. And that's all of these will come more like a bonus. And I don't care much about what I'm going to do with that tree later on. I just wanted to have that tree there to help me to bring all of these benefits, mainly thinking about my animal. But I can move a little bit forward and say, no, I want to add income. And then I bring to you this picture here on your right. That's a farm of one of my friends in Florida. And in the back, you can see pecans is spaced far enough that you can have animals grazing there if you need. So when you think about adding income, you will have all of the ecosystem benefits as well. But the tree additions will not affect your forage production. You don't want to get rid of any of your cows. You just want to add trees that will bring to you everything good. But you may be able to harvest pecans and sell it, on Saturday when you go to your local fair. And it's going to bring another source of income to you. But again, cannot affect your livestock production. Good. What if you decide that you are okay with it? And yes, you can accept that you are going to replace some of it because you want to have so many trees there that the tree insertion may result in sufficient shading and competition that it's going to reduce your forage productivity, and consequently, you need to reduce your stocking rates. You can do this, but when you think about a silvopasture system, when we were replacing things, The tree revenue must be able to help you to pay for the losses you are having in the livestock system. So in this case, I will bring the same farm here. And you can see in your left side, just income addition. I want to keep big areas with pasture. I will keep my animals there. In your right side, much more trees, where you have the plus sign on here, much higher tree density. In this place, I don't care if I need to reduce a little bit my number of animals, because I'm targeting to have tree benefits enough that it will help me to pay for the bills. Why do I like to have this kind of conversation with you guys? Because, you know, you may want to just have ecosystem services. You may want to add income. You may want to replace that. You want to have more from the trees. And you will find farmers with all of these bills. And some of them, you may need to convince them in the very beginning to go through the ecosystem service. And then they may end up adding even more trees. And later on, they may be able to visualize the benefit of having two businesses instead of only one. Good. Hopefully you guys follow me up to this thing. 3 or 4 considerations here just before we finish and wrap it up. Okay? First one, everything comes from the sun, sunlight. That's what we need, right? To be able to get our ribeye or New York strip at the end of the day. In between, forage accumulation, intake, digestion, the whole livestock process here, where we are going to grow forage, where we are going to graze, where we are going to understand what's going on in the rumen, and then convert. The beauty of converting sunlight in ribeye, milk. All of this process will be there happening exactly like this in a Silvopasture systems. What is the difference here? We are putting a 3 in between the sunlight and the pasture. And now we are creating a new barrier that are going to take some of this sunlight. And John already showed to you guys that some plants will be, liking this, especially the cool season ones, but the warm season ones will be the ones saying, well, the more sun we have here, the better it will be for me, right? So what I want you to consider is every time you were adding that 3 there, all of the other steps ahead, they will be impacted at some point, especially pretty close to the trees, especially in the place where you have the shade being projected over the pasture, right? And here, it will be very interesting to think about grazing management. It'll be very interesting to think that, having 2 pastures will be better than having only one, so I can have my cows going back and forth. Having 3 may be better than having only 2. So when I'm using 1/3 of my pasture, the other 2/3 will be grazing, will be resting, and I'll be able to replace the energy. I'll be able to grow my forage when I'm using rotational grazing. If you are going to establish trees, having several paddocks may help you to move your trees around and maybe not come back to the one that you were planting trees for a while. And may be able to build your silvopasture systems, not only in a single year, but you are going to have a plan that every year you are going to kind of stockpile one pasture and do not graze that one because you are doing such a job there to establish your trees for a while. It may help you to also define your arrangements. How do you want to design your silvopasture systems? From a single pasture, an open pasture, can you just, plant a few trees there? Yes, you can. You may want strips. You may want to double strips, triple trees. You may want to have like squares of trees with small groves where you can fence them around. And every year, you are going to put new ones. Because who else is working with trees and livestock? You're not getting out of the business next year, right? You didn't get into this to be done in 2 or 3 years. It's a long-term thing. We are talking about trees that will be there for 20, 30, 40 years for us. So you can do it every year a little bit and move your electric fence and maybe, have like a chess table like this. You may want to have groves and having 6, 7, 8, trees side by side and have a big slot there. And you know that under this area, you're not going to have too much forage, but the cows will be able to go back and forth from the open area to the tree area. Or you may decide that you're going to work all around it, and you are going to have only close to the fence the trees you need. And I have been spending some time on Google trying to identify what kind of arrangements we have in the southern US. And I found those farms here, and I want to share with you. Some of them, you can see, that's a fence line, and they have been leaving the trees behind there. Some of them, they have been just deciding to leave a few trees behind. And so you can have this more scattered pattern there where you have trees here and there. You may have farmers that they are doing both. Some of them, they will have, small groves like this. They may have here a source of water, and they left a little bit more trees around here. So yes, we do have a lot of people trying to include trees already in our problems. And I would say that along the fence is the one I have been seeing the most, where we can deal better. You may just want to pull electric fence for a while there and make sure that you can protect these trees for a year, 2, 3, that you feel comfortable enough that you can release the animals. They are not going to mess up with everything. So you do. So think about all of these things and how you can handle it in the project. Bruno, can I crop it while I'm growing the trees? Yes, you can. Why not? If you have livestock systems and you need silage, for example, why don't you corn there for 2 or 3 years, and then it became a silvopasture system? And then we can call it a agroforestry system for a while. Can I grow corn in the situation like this for 10, 20 years? No, you cannot. Well, yes, you can, but the impact of the shade will be so much that the corn will be not, with good yield and doesn't work. And the taller the trees are getting, you will start to see this kind of difference. I took these 4 pictures in the same day, in the same field. And the difference here is just how far the corn plant is from the tree. So 13 feet apart, 24, 36, and 15 feet away from the tree grows. The ones that were 15 feet away, 15 feet away from the grove, they were mature and ready to be harvested. And the ones here close to the trees, you can see is still green with a very small ear as well. So yes, there is an effect on the corn here, especially after 5, 6, 7 years. This one here was taken maybe in the 5th or the 6th year after the trees were there. Trees very, very tall at this point. So in the first 2, 3 years that you have small trees, it's easy. What is the biggest issue here? You need to take care of herbicide application. You may come here to spray herbicides in your corn, and you may kill all of your trees. So you got to take care of this. You got to be in a day without the wind, with all the protections we have for weed spray. Good. Can I hay it? Sure, you can. And maybe that's the best way to do in the first year or so. Instead of bringing animals here to graze, you put up hay. You have your bales there. You move everything out, and you sell hay, or you use hay for your own operation for a few days, okay? For a few years. So those are things that I would like to share with you all based on my experience with Silvopasture System. 2 things I want to share with you guys that you need to avoid when we are talking about Silvopasture Systems. The first one is a single tree, right? You don't want to have a single tree and call it a Silvopasture system. You're going to have all of your animals hanging out there and killing all of the pastures below it. So avoid it. If you are going to leave the trees behind, don't leave one by itself. Put them spread around, scatter around. That's fine. And if you are planting a silvopasture like this here in your right side, study, the tree canopy. Be aware of the tree canopy. How much light can you make through this? It's going to help you to define how apart the trees needs to be. And this one here, this farmer didn't know how big the canopy tree could go. And they plant the trees close enough that 5, 6 years later, the canopy was touching itself. And all the plants here were in trouble, especially because here we are talking about warm season plants. So if you don't have light enough below that, your planted silvopasture may not be worked out. Okay. Let's wrap up. What if we are talking about a woodland that you want to graze? I want you to take care of the tree density. I want you to think in the long term, what you have before, what you're going to have after. Pick the trees you want to leave behind and make a plan to figure out what are the ones you are going to get rid of. Okay, so you can make your good tree density to be able to have your animals there. Meanwhile, forage enrichment in the understory to make sure that you have more and more forage in your woodland. And also grazing management. I already mentioned, you got a rotational grazing that thing. You cannot leave the animals here and think that the forage that are already struggling with less light than the normal, they will be growing faster. No, they will be growing slower than they used to grow, right? So grazing management here is very, very important. You got to take care of it. If you were thinking about a planted silvopasture, that you are going to plant the trees, that you can design everything square in rows and groves or whatever, I want you to think again about grazing management and how you can set your rotational grazing in a way that you can set paddocks apart, that you can hay, that you can plant corn, that you can avoid grazing for a while you're growing your trees, especially here, right? That a tree can take years and years and years to be tall enough that we will be okay, that tree is there. And here I stole some numbers from Dr. Fike and the crew that has been working around here. We have been, suggesting that if you're talking about hardwood trees, you can plan to have around 30. And if you're talking about softwood trees, you can have 100, 120. You can have a little bit more. Again, consider the species, consider the canopy size, consider how much light you are taking from the sun and impacting it in terms of reducing the ability of your forage to grow. And prefer cool season forage, right? Because warm season plants will need much more sunlight than cool season forage. The efficiency will be better here under shade conditions for cool season forage. And then those would be the ones we would recommend to you guys to be targeting on. So, Liliane, again, thanks for having me here today. I think you guys could have some of the insights in the silvopasture system that I have here from my side. It's a tough job after John, but anyway, I try to survive here after him. If you guys have questions or if you want to discuss something, I may ask John to answer the question as well. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pedreira. So we do have some questions. And the first one is actually something that you just spoke about. So what grasses or forages grow better under the G system with the filtered sunlight available, as opposed to a condition where they would be exposed to full sunlight?
Yeah, I think that's the case of the cool season plants, right? Fescue, orchard grass, those plants will deal better with the lack of sunlight. Plants like Bermuda, I think they are mentioned here, Eastern gammon grass, all of these warm season plants, they will struggle a little bit more. So if I would pick some, I would try to stick with the cool season plants you already have available in your property.
Sure, thank you. I want to maybe just complement this question. What about areas, for example, the low country in South Carolina or some areas where we are hotter? Do you think maybe native warm season grasses or some other species could work? Because we cannot grow tall pasture, for example, in portions of the southeast or southern region, even South Carolina. So what would be the options that we could have for those areas?
You can work with all of the warm season plants. Let me make it clear, right? You can do it with warm season plants. I did it a lot in Brazil. We only have warm season plants there, and they can grow well. The point here is the tolerance. Somebody just mentioned here Bahia grass, for example. Bahia grass has a better tolerance to shade as well, right? They can do it. what I would do is, if I have a area with a little bit higher tree density, in this area, I will target cool season plants. If I have areas with less tree density, in these areas, we can target warm season plants. If you are planning to start a new silvopasture area, you're going to establish there, I will try to stick with less trees per acre in the very beginning. And then you can add more throughout the years. And then you feel like, yes, my plants are going a little bit thinner now than they were last year. So that may be an indicator to you to thin a little bit the area. John, please.
Well, so I'm going to give you the counterpoint arguments there. Some of the systems that we worked with, again, temperate hardwood systems, they were planted at higher density with the anticipation of thinning over time to allow light to come back into those systems. And I think, so if I'm in the low country and I'm planting, I might be planting a pine system. I'd want to have fairly wide alleys where I can. I'd like to run those rows north-south orientation. The further north you go, the more important that, the further north you go, the more the north-south orientation kind of works in your favor. Because as the sun goes over, the shade is cast, through the peak sunlight right down the tree row. So it's not so much in the alley space. And then as you're thinking about these systems, particularly with pine, we do have pulp markets. And so maybe you planted originally at a 10-foot spacing between trees within a row. And then you can come back and thin out every other one or something like that. Say maybe at a 13, 15-year mark, something kind of mid-rotation. So you're actively planning to take some of that stuff to market before these trees reach size. The warm season species, they work in these systems, but again, it's probably better to have rows with fairly decent alley size so that you have a lot of light in there to support that productivity during the warm season. Whereas if you have more distributed shade, kind of what Bruno was talking about, that can be more problematic for growing the warm season species. The other thing, Bruno, maybe I missed it, the comment on thinning. I want to encourage, if you're going to thin, please reach out and find a forester who can give you some good advice on that. One of the things that we see at times is thinning. People say, well, I'm going to take all these big, trees that have better value, and then the trees that are sort of medium size, or they're not dominant trees, they're going to grow rapidly. Well, what happens is they've been shaded. So then when you cut those big trees, those medium-sized trees get stressed. So in many cases, it may be actually better to take the medium-sized trees and some of the smaller diameter junk wood if you've got a pulp market, and leave some of those larger trees that are less stressed. Or, if it's not a dominant tree, it probably at least should be co-dominant. But that varies by tree species, and that's why it's very helpful to have a consulting forester look at the trees with you and give you some good consideration for whether it's going to be economical and how to approach creating the thinning practices that you want.
Mm-hmm. And just as a reminder, we do have the type of service through the extension systems, wherever you are throughout the USA. So definitely reach out to your extension forestry team, and they can provide those recommendations and do like a farm visits as well. So the next question that I have here, Dr. Pedreira, is could you expand on the negative effects of trees on livestock and how to mitigate those?
I think that the only negative effect I can see of trees on livestock would be the excess of shade, right? And that would not be exactly on the livestock, it would be on the forage that will be short to having livestock. I think that's when, if I mention something negative here today, it would be like this. If you have a too dense area with a lot of trees, that your grass will not be able to grow well. And that's what John was explaining as well, that we need to thin over time. We need to have this idea of what the market wants, especially if you are going from a woodland and you are trying to bring it to a silvopasture systems. I think that's one of the things I have been seeing the most here in Tennessee. Some of our farmers that have been reaching out to me said, Bruno, I have this woodland here. There is not much using on this. I would like to make some money out of it. So we have been planning what would be the good way to select the harvest that needs to be gone, and then we can bring livestock on these, but in a way that forage will be able to grow and we will be able to make some money out of this.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll like to weigh in from a different perspective. I think there are concerns at times that trees may have toxins that are detrimental to livestock. I have people say, well, our cows filled up on acorns and they, died of tannin toxicity or whatever, or they'll eat some kind of tree species that have saponins in them and say, that killed them. But a lot of the kind of toxicology studies that were done, some time back looking at, say, Robinia poisoning, which Robinia can be a problem for horses. And that Robinia comes from, Robinia is the genus name for black locust. So you could have a horse that debarks a black locust tree and then has this problem. Well, if you managed it appropriately, that horse would not have debarked the tree in the first place. But many of the toxicology studies happen, they show a toxic effect when they feed only that one substance. And all plants have toxins. Pretty much all our foods have toxins. Some of you probably have drunk beer before, and I don't know, but it's got a toxin in it, right? So we offset one toxin with others. And a lot of these toxicology studies are, to me, quite artificial, because an animal that's in a well-managed system has the potential to eat a diverse diet, and it's not going to load up on one thing that causes a problem. If you know that your woods are full of white oak acorns, and your cows like them, then you need to think about, okay, I've got to limit their access to that if that's truly going to be a problem. But probably those tannins are not a problem if that animal is eating not just acorns but also other diverse forages. So I hear a lot about, the cows are going to die from this. We have a tree at one of our sites that has saponins, and it's purportedly toxic. I go in and see all the browsing that's been done on those trees, and the steers are just rocking on. But they're eating lots of other stuff besides that one resource.
Good, John. Yeah, I like to mention as well that sometimes we will find some animals with this kind of behavior. And one of the situations I visited, the problem was there was no forage there. The lack of forage in the understory was kind of intriguing these animals to go up and using whatever they were finding, right? One of the silvopastures I had the biggest issue in the very beginning of my career was the guy said, yeah, the animals just ate all of the trees we planted. And we went there to check, and there was no pasture again, a very degraded area that the guys were trying to get a silvopasture out of this. That leaf on the tree, that was the only green thing we have in the whole area. So the animals were grazing wherever they find in front of them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. So does anybody have any other questions? No? So Dr. Pedreira, just before I let you go, I just wanted to, so one of the things that you talked about is like the system with rotation, the agroforestry system, like rotation with other crops. Can you just give us a little other like examples, like other row crops that we could rotate, just as a general example, because this is not a concept that a lot of people from here are familiar with. But I know you have done a lot of research on that in Brazil, and there are some different rotations that people are using in other parts of the world. So just an example to expand a little bit.
Yeah, I think the main idea with these agroforest systems, well, crop livestock forest systems, when they are trying to do this, is especially because they don't want to spend the money to protect the trees. They don't want to have cages or fences or anything else to protect the trees for a while. So they will have the trees a little bit more in a systematic way, and groves a little bit more apart. And that dimension, that the way they're going to define the spacement between trees or groves will be based on the equipment you have. The planter, the harvester, the sprayer. You got to take all of these things in consideration and make multiples of that thing, right? So if your largest equipment there has 50 feet, you got to have 55, 60 at least in between trees so you can run with that thing. And they will do it for 2 or 3 years while the trees are growing and they are using the land with other things. So I already saw it with rice, with corn, with beans. And again, I already mentioned that during the presentation. The main thing here is you got to take care of herbicide application. Otherwise, you can kill your trees. In most of these systems, they will do forage crop forestry for 3, 4, 5 years maybe, and then it became a silvopasture system. So you can bring back your pastures, you plant them back, and the trees are in good shape to make sure that you're going to have a beautiful silvopasture system, very efficient, and the animals will not hurt none of the trees for a while. But yeah, you can grow virtually wherever you want, and especially with the trees. Sometimes they have trees that they take a lot to grow, and you can do it with other crops for a while, and then you may be able to come back and hay it for a while, and then you bring the animals back. I think but the main idea is to do not leave that land without being used while you were growing your trees.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for that, for expanding on that example. Does anybody have any questions that we didn't address yet before we adjourn? Well, hearing none, let's just show our appreciation for the speakers and thanking them a lot for sharing all this content with us today. Please, on the chat, we are sharing a few links with you. A couple of them are about surveys. One of the surveys is just a feedback in terms of this event, and we just wanted to get a little more information from you. The other one is for a silvopasture grant through Intercess that Dr. Haller and myself are collaborating together here in South Carolina. And we have put together this survey, so we'd like to ask you to please answer it. And also, please note that we're going to have a field day on April 11th. And Mrs. Steele just shared information, also the link for the registration here on the chat. So if you'd like to, if you're in South Carolina and you'd like to join, please go ahead and register. We only have 10 spots left for the field day on April 11th. Well, with that, I thank you so much for being here with us today. And I thank you again, both of our speakers. We appreciate your information, your time with us today. And I hope to see everybody next week on the next webinar. We're going to have a roundtable with specialists, extension agents, and producers about Silvopasture systems. Thank you so much and have a good day.